Welcome everyone to the 2021 Project Management Symposium. Today we're going to be talking about building your value delivery system. So first of all, by way of introduction, I'm Jay Deckert. I'm a strategic planning and project management consultant. And since 2013, I've been working with a small consulting firm called Is Inspired. And together we handle complex projects, multi-department, across many organizations, and build infrastructure for channel ecosystems. And what that means is I get to see a lot of different organizations and how they deliver value in a lot of different ways. And so we're going to cover a lot today. We're going to cover the value delivery system as it's defined in the new PMI 7, which I'm excited about. We're going to go through a real life example on a type of project that I've set up recently. And then we're going to go through some scenarios. Normally I'd pull a live audience, but I pulled LinkedIn instead. And so we're going to go through some of the scenarios that came up when I interviewed some of the folks from there. First of all, I'm going to talk about what I am not going to talk about during this presentation. I am not ready to talk about what is on the certification test. I'm not a trainer, I'm not an expert. And there's also a section in there called the product management and value delivery through product management. I'm not going to cover that either because I'm not an expert there. Where I do have expertise is in the strategy, portfolio, program, and projects to operations section, which is the bulk of this value delivery system. So I'm going to be talking about that the most. So what we are going to talk about is what that value delivery system is, what it looks like when you map it out, and then how you can build it yourself, either independently or with a team, or help your whole organization build it and map it out. All right, so let's look at the value delivery system as it's listed off in the new PMI. Honestly, when I first heard about this value delivery system, it sounded a little bit like corporate speak, a little bit like consultant jargon, which I'm very familiar with. And so I'm excited to look through it and see that there's actually a lot more to it there than just kind of open talk. So after doing that research, I was happily surprised to see that there is a really useful framework underneath all of that. It was built to respond to some problems that the PMI has had in the past. Historically, it's really been difficult to transition project deliverables into operations and into business value. A lot of times, whatever system was set up wouldn't get used, or whatever project was delivered that took 2 years was irrelevant by the time it was launched. And a lot of times, operations just has difficulty absorbing new processes and new procedures that projects deliver. And so there's a lack of the value translating from the strategic plan through a new project and through into the operations and business benefits. And so this value delivery system concept is built to address that. It's also recently becoming harder to separate projects from operations. With the success of the DevOps method of doing things and continuous delivery, where you see changes, you make changes live, you're continuing to adapt on very versatile systems, it's actually really hard to separate projects and operations in the way that was previously defined in the PMI in other versions. And so now this value delivery system brings it all together so you can track strategy through portfolio, through projects, through operations. And that's what this picture is here. It's a beautiful mind style method of describing what I'm going to break down here in more detail. So first, let's talk about the components as they are listed out in the PMI 7. Most of these are going to be very familiar. The difference is they're used in one system as opposed to separating project from operations like they've been in the past. So the components you're going to be familiar with. You have your portfolios. First of all, you have your strategic planning and your goals up front, and then that translates through organizational portfolios, programs, projects, products as well, and into operations. And how they're set up in this particular methodology is they all work together in line with the organization's strategy with very few breaks in between. There's not separate projects and separate offices for the project piece of it versus separate departments handling the organizational functions. They all work together on the project's teams to deliver what you're trying to set up. And the second, and I think the most important piece of this, is the information flow. Information needs to both come to and come from the leadership through those portfolio projects, operations, et cetera, in a bunch of different ways. And so the feedback loops from how a project is doing to how it's translating into the business operations and back is really important. And the more live and the less time in between when that information is generated and when those reports are built or when those meetings happen, the closer that can become to live, the better it'll be. And we'll go through some of that when we go through our live example. So overlaying on that components, the actual boxes of work that you have to do, and the information that flows between those boxes is the governance model. So governance isn't just directors and VPs making decisions from on high and telling the various functions what to do. That governance usually involves managers from those functions and the project and program managers making decisions, managing issues, smoothing the work through when it's designed, through when it's executed, through when it's operationalized. Everyone in the governance needs to provide oversight of what's happening as a whole. They control what's happening, live as problems arise. They integrate across different functions, and in our case, a lot of across different organizations, and they assess the value that's coming out of those various components. So by the time a project launches, you have to always go back and say, what's the ROI here? What have we learned? What have we done? What have we produced that's actually of value to the business? And is this what we expected, or is it different? And if it's different, what do we need to change in the future? And so pulling it together, beneath this whole structure are all the various functions. And so when I think functions, you generally think of marketing and sales and IT and legal and HR and all the different business functions that have some kind of interaction with either the project work as it's going on or the operations that it's translating into. And so all of those functions have a performing the work role. Obviously, they have tasks on a project plan. That's the first thing most people think of. But they're also responsible for providing oversight and coordinating the information as it flows across all these systems. They provide their resources. Every project team needs some slice of those different related functions to help out where necessary. They facilitate and support the other teams. So, for example, a marketing team may have a big chunk of work at the end of the project, but they need to facilitate and support the project team earlier in the project to get what they need by the time it's their turn. They lend expertise. They give objectives and feedback for what they need out of the project and as it translates into actual business, provide insights, give business direction, and participate in that governance structure, like I said before. And so if you think about an individual project in this value delivery system, it has an internal environment, right? And so when we talk about the internal environment as it's defined in this framework, that includes all your process assets. That includes your governance documentation, your data assets, knowledge assets, security and safety procedures. Your organizational culture and the governance is included there. There's geographic assets, like where your facilities and resources lie. There's your infrastructure assets, both physical and information infrastructure. There's your IT, your software, resource availability, and employee capability. All those things are listed out as kind of a checklist for you to think about when you're thinking about a project and what it needs in order to complete its goals. All of those things are things to think through and understand where those live in your organization. Now, this is a long list and it seems like a lot to do, but in most organizations that have been around for any amount of time, a lot of these things are just a given, right? They're just part of the culture and they're part of the system, and so you don't have to think about them too much as you're assessing how you deliver value through this environment. What you should do is go through and say, hey, what am I missing here? What is a weak spot here that I really should address? What should I go look for? What should I go further understand before moving forward? You should be able to kind of do a back of the napkin assessment on most of these list of things in order to get your project set up the way they need to be. And so aside from the internal environment, something we often ignore is the external environment. A big one for most of the organizations that we work with is that marketplace conditions, where you may have a plan at the beginning of the year and you're working on executing that plan throughout the year, and marketplace conditions have shifted by the time the original launch date might have been. And so looking back to see what's changed and what's new and what you need to adapt to is something that's very easy to miss while you're focusing on delivering what you said you were going to deliver. If you said, we're going to launch on this date and here's what we're going to have, and what you need changes during that time, you don't get extra points for delivering something that is less useful by the time it comes out. But other things to think about in that external environment category are industry standards. The regulatory environment is an important one for any kind of industry that's highly regulated, like your aerospace or your pharmaceutical, that kind of thing. Financial considerations are important. Your physical environment are important if you have some kind of physical plant for your organization. Obviously, the less important for a software as a service company, more important for a company who's laying down railroads, that kind of thing. But commercial and academic information, what's changing in your intellectual ecosystem is important to think about when you're talking about external environment. And then your social and cultural influences are important as well. And so in summary here, this is what the value delivery system as defined in the guidelines includes. It's pretty comprehensive. There's a lot here. The rest of the PMBOK goes into details, again, about the project and program management, but all of that as set aside on its own is not as useful if you can't see the whole map, right? The start to finish. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? How is it delivering value to our business? And so the components, the information flow, governance, the functions, and the environments, that's what makes up your value delivery system. So when we go through and map our own, that's where we're going to start. We're going to take those lists of things, box them out, find out what is solid, what is good, where you have gaps, and show you how to map that out for yourself. So with all that academic research out of the way about what the PMBOK says about value delivery, let's look at a specific example. So this is a recent example that we built with our organization. It is not built with the value delivery system as defined in the PMBOK in mind, but it has so many of the components that I thought it would be a good example to show the different pieces and how they all fit together. And so what we're looking at here, and we'll zoom in a second, is a project portfolio pipeline for mergers and acquisitions. So basically, a large company has a pipeline of potential mergers and acquisitions that they're considering, right? There's a backlog of capabilities they need, organizations they want to either collaborate with or purchase outright or merge with, and the leadership of that company needs to make tough decisions about what to buy versus what to create themselves. And so when a project comes from that pipeline and says, okay, we're merging with this company, we're acquiring this company, that triggers a very large and complex project plan that's generally templated, but then customized and tailored for the specific acquisition or merger. And that integration needs to be handled very carefully in a very specific sequence and in a very specific time frame, as you can imagine. So any project that has a certain amount of complexity within itself, right, within its organization, imagine taking that and then duplicating that with another organization because legal terms have to come together. HR has to work together. There's decisions that are going to need to be made about, do we need to hire more people? Do we need to fire more people as redundancies are identified across these organizations? There's an entire IT infrastructure that you have to talk about. Is this mergeable? Do we MuleSoft it together? Do we microservice this thing? Do we cancel one and port all the data over? A lot of tough decisions have to be made about that merging of IT. And then obviously the sales and the marketing need to have a pretty solid roadmap about why this purchase was made, how it integrates with the base value proposition of the company. There's just so many factors that have to go involved once that decision is made to make this acquisition. And in any given time, there could be several of these going on in different stages, right? So a lot of deals are being considered. Some are just being acquired and being announced to the marketplace in general. Some are about to be acquired, but they're in stealth mode. They're not allowed to tell anybody yet. And other ones are in full acquisition mode where they're launching products together, right? Either as separate brands or as one brand or as a technology embedded in another brand. There's just a lot of complexity. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of people that need to know a lot of information about how those things are going. If something is going to hold you up, if something is going to be a risk or change what the original assumptions are, everybody needs to know pretty quickly. And so the value delivered here is, did we make a purchase? Is that purchase delivering the value we want to by the time we wanted it to, right? How is this merger working? And are we selling what we wanted to sell? Are we doing what we need to do or what we need to change? So the subcomponents of this chunk of the value delivery system, the portfolio level is from start to finish, all of the projects that are being considered, the ones that are, a deal has been done and we need to do an integration, and the ones that are fully integrated. The program we're looking at is the suite of projects that are in that integration piece. Those are the ones that are most important to this particular system. Each of those companies that's being merged is their own project on itself. And within that project, there is a project plan and a project dashboard that's kind of all-inclusive for the strategic operations team who's doing that merger. And then there's a bunch of work streams that are specific to the different functions in those organizations. So there's legal, an HR, a sales, a marketing, an IT, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so each of those groups needs their own work stream with their own set of tasks. They do not and should not see all the different legal and HR ramifications, but they need to be focused on what they're working on. And those streams need to be two-sided so that two groups can come together and look at the same information all the time. So the actual construction of the system here, there's a lot of different pieces, and that's why mapping it out this way early was really important, because otherwise it's going to be really hard to sprawl out spreadsheets with hundreds of tasks on every tab and not knowing who needs to look at what. And what's really important about this whole system is this information flow piece. And so information has to come from the pipeline portion of the portfolio saying, here's the deals that are upcoming. We need to get these started. Then when the deal is executed and announced, those project plans have to start right away. So the information coordination from left to right is really important. And then the information flow within the different work streams for the project is very important. It's not enough to wait for a bi-weekly meeting to say, we missed this deadline, we don't know what we're doing here, we're pushing this out. It's going to affect all the other work streams. And so based on the initial schedule, if anything is risking yellow to red, everyone else really needs to know about it like within a week's time. And so across the different organizations, information flow is important too. So the HR in one group needs to be aware of what the HR in the other group is completing and doing. All that needs to come up to that strategic operations group, and they need to see what is happening across all the different projects aside from those different silos too. So there's a lot of up and down, left and right information flow that needs to happen in a system like this. So all that information is used both to operate the project and execute the project, as well as inform the governance of each of those projects. So there's obviously a governance of deciding which projects should come in and out of this project plan environment, but there's also a lot of governance about what to do when issues arise, how to handle risks, how to handle decisions are a big one, like what infrastructure are we going to use, what teams are we going to use, how is this going to work. That information is critical to the governance piece of this ecosystem, because without that information, people are going to be making those decisions pretty blindly. And so below all of this, a function within, let's say the merger organization, not the merging organization, they have tasks lists off of their workflows for the various projects that are going on, but they also need to pull together those workflows across the different projects. So the marketing department, let's say, needs to know, here's when we need early versions of these documents. Here's when we need final versions of these documents. Here's when we need announcement, launch information, that kind of thing. That all has to be pulled into a calendar that they can see across all the projects. So each function underneath the many projects needs to have all the information they need, not just for a project on its own, but across all the different projects so that they know what their resourcing needs to look like in that near future of how these projects are coming together. And so with those functions, the oversight, the coordination, they're providing resources to all these projects, they're doing the work, they're supporting the teams, they're giving expertise on the projects, all the things we looked at before. And they all, again, have to get the same information that the overall governance structure needs in order to make educated decisions about how these projects are going. So what we've pulled up here are actual examples of what some of these projects lists would look like if you were to look at them just as the components themselves. It's nothing complicated. It's nothing you haven't seen before. There are task lists, there are Gantt chart schedules, there's calendars, dashboards, risk and issue logs. All of the components are nothing that anyone would be unfamiliar with if you've managed projects before. The thing that's different about it is looking how they fit into the structure overall, looking at why they're there, who needs to see what permissions need to be in place in order for these different groups to have access to these different pieces of information, and how all that information is used in meetings and in decision-making, working sessions, and that kind of thing. And so here's a good time to stress the importance of making a map before you make the components. If you just start listing all these tasks and doing all these schedules before understanding where they fit in the overall value delivery system, you're probably going to be bogged down, get into the weeds really fast. It's going to seem like an impossible task as you build out all the things that need to happen. Whereas if you map it out and put everything in its own little box, as tasks come up and as work comes up, you can put it in the box that it belongs to, and it'll develop over time into something that's versatile and adaptable and actually delivers what you need to deliver, as opposed to a huge list that's completely overwhelming just based on the volume alone. And so talking back to the environments that these projects exist in, this is the other component of this value delivery system model. The internal environment in this case would be interesting because it's two-sided, right? It's not just one internal set of assets and governance models and data and knowledge, et cetera. It's two sets, right? There's two different cultures coming together. There's two different legal groups coming together. There's two different software structures coming together. And so all that has to be considered twice when considering your internal environment for this particular example. And in this case, the external environment is also really important because these are projects that can't be announced until the deal is signed, right? So there needs to be some work done stealthily to get ready. And then when it's announced, it needs to be publicly dealt with, and it needs to be internally dealt with. There's a lot of political and social and cultural things that need to be considered. And obviously the marketplace conditions are a big one in the external environment here as well, because as soon as a merger is announced, a lot of other competition is going to start countering that with their own messaging. And so in these cases, that's a really important thing to think about as well. So let's move off of my hypothetical merger and acquisition example and talk about building your own example. We're going to talk the keys to building this out, questions you want to ask, the components, how they all fit together, and what to actually do with it when you have it. And so if you want to build your own value delivery system, it's going to be hard to just start from scratch and build it, right? It's likely that if you work in an organization, you have one of these, something already exists. And if you can't find a map of it or a description of it or a process for it, you can start building it yourself and showing it to people and explaining it to people and getting information from people so that you can all be on the same page when it comes to making decisions, when it comes to selling your products, when it comes to delivering your projects. And so some of the keys to building this from scratch, if you were to be so inclined to do so, are visualization. The map I showed is one overlay piece of all the different components that would go underneath that map. But without that overlay piece, if you just tried to describe what you were trying to do, it's usually very hard to do. And different people are going to come away from those conversations thinking very different things. And so having that initial visual that says, this is what we're looking at start to finish, this is the whole thing, is really important to get everybody on the same page and to make the edits you need to make in order to build it out. Another important piece is connecting the components and showing how they relate to each other visually in that space, right? So you've got lines and boxes. There's nothing complicated. You can do it in PowerPoint. You can do it with a pen. You can do it on a whiteboard, however is more comfortable to you. But showing how the different pieces are contained within other pieces and how they interact back and forth and how the information flows is important. Because again, writing it out or describing it, I find to be very limited in how well I can communicate to people how this stuff works. And once you have that all mapped out, it'll help you understand the process better. It'll help other people understand the process better. And it'll help you resolve issues when it comes to disagreements about how the process should be or how it should work. And so the second piece here is the questions you need to ask. You can start by asking these questions to yourself about how much you know about your own organization's value delivery system, right? Is it formal or informal? Some companies have a formal annual strategic planning process where they say, here's the goals for the year, here's what each department needs to do, here's what each function needs to do, here's the set of projects we're going to use, here's how they're going to be funded, resourced, et cetera. Other companies have a very informal way of doing that. It's either a top-down or it's kind of a bottom-up. It's kind of a lean, market-driven method. However it is it written down or is it not written down? Is it visible or is it invisible? Meaning, can I go and see this is how our annual planning process is supposed to work? Or is it just something that happens and everyone has to respond to it and it's different every time? Is there a structure to it? Is it unstructured? Where is it structured? Where is it unstructured? That kind of thing. Do you use a known system that other companies use, or is it homegrown? A lot of things we've seen is there is partially a known structure like OKRs or SMART goals or that kind of thing. And then there's also a organic structure that works alongside or in conflict with about actually getting the work done that needs to get done. And so mapping this out for yourself and for your organization is an important way of showing this is what we say we do. This is what we actually do. What's important here? What can we get rid of on either side in order to make this process work for everybody? So if you start by querying yourself about what you know about your organization and starting to build a map, it's obviously better to build it in something that's flexible, like your PowerPoint or your Visio, that kind of thing. You can start querying other people as well. Your managers, the people you work with, people who've been around for a while. Depending on how interested people are, they may be like, oh my gosh, this is really exciting. I'm glad someone's finally doing this. They may also say, oh, we have something like this. We have a deck from 2 years ago when the last time we did this, right? You're going to learn things that you may not have learned about how your organization works if you start asking these questions. You may also be connected with, oh, this is this person's job. Why don't you ask them? They'll know, or let them handle it, whatever. Figure it out for yourself how much you want to ask other people about how this works versus how much you just want to build it yourself. But How I start is for the components section where you have programs, projects, portfolios, operations, products, all that kind of thing. I start with boxes, right? They're very easy to delineate. You say, this is this project, this is this team, this is this operations. You can just white space it, put it on boxes however you think they make sense, and then put boxes within those boxes however that makes sense. And then for the information flow piece of it, that's a good thing to connect with lines. Take a different color, say, from the project, we need to report to our management, status, timeline, risks, issues, all the classic stuff, finances, right? These people need to know this type of information. These people need to know that type of information. There's good examples in that value delivery section about the types of information that you need to go forward and you need to go back. So, for example, going forward, you need strategic goals to turn into projects. That information needs to be transferred. The backlog or the back loop needs to be status and results of those projects need to feed back into that strategic planning model. Into operations, what needs to happen, who needs to do what, task information needs to flow out, and then results, is it successful, what do we need to change, what are the risks need to flow back. So there's a cycle, there's larger and smaller cycles in those information flows, and drawing those out with your basic lines is a good way to do it. On top of it, either as a new layer or outside of it, put your governance model pieces, right? Go, here's the leadership team, here's the legal team, here's the different functions that need to have representation in this ecosystem, who needs to make what decisions, what information do they need to know to make these decisions, when do they need these decisions, do you have a quarterly planning cycle where these decisions need to be made at a certain time, is it ongoing, is there an IT review every 2 weeks, what information do they need? Show around the whole thing who needs what information and by when to help that decision. And that's your governance model. And then the functions is, again, who needs to actually do what by when, who's not part of the specific project team. Who external to that needs to know what do they need to do, how do they need to influence the system as a whole. And so once you've built all that out, you've got the components of a value delivery system. And it's likely that you'll be able to do it yourself just by sitting down and drawing it, and then you'll be able to build it and edit it and formalize it and grow it into something the rest of your team can use. We've seen in our past experience very basic models that we've developed just as notes to help us understand how our different companies work as we come into a new organization for a consulting agreement for a term. We say, okay, how does this plan made? Who decided how this project is supposed to move forward? How do we know it's done? That kind of thing. We've seen those basic slides screenshotted and put into many other decks to explain how the whole process works, just because in some cases no one else has done it. And so don't be afraid to build it out, even though might not be your official job title. Build it anyway, just for yourself, and build it just for your team. And if you keep building it until you find other people using it, great. If they show other versions of the things, you can either integrate it or work with them to improve it and to propagate it so that everybody knows how it works. The important thing is everybody should be able to see how the whole system works so they know what their piece of the project should look like. So normally this is the time where I would poll the audience for real life scenarios and some Q&A. But since this is recorded, I've gone out to LinkedIn and ran a few interviews with a handful of my project management cohort that I know in the area. And they've come up with a few scenarios as we talk through these things that fell into basically 3 different buckets. And so the first of those buckets is we don't have a system like that. It's, we may have a value delivery system, but it's not formal. I don't really know what it is. I just do my work. I just do my projects. And even if it's not formal, your organization does have a value delivery system. Otherwise, it would probably be out of business. Anyone who is thoroughly convinced that they do not deliver value, I'd love to talk to them and see why they get paid. But if it's not formal and you can't find what it is, just draft the basics for yourself. Go through that list. List out the components, list out how it works, who governs it, et cetera, and then you have the basics of where these things fit. A lot of the times people who say our organization doesn't really do that, on the flip side of it is they also aren't really sure how the projects they're working on help the business as a whole. A lot of cases, people work on projects that are 3 layers deep, right? You're doing an infrastructure upgrade. You're doing something very specific within an organization that doesn't really have a customer-facing view. And to me, that can kind of be demoralizing, right? You're working on something that you care about and your team cares about, but no one else really cares about. It's hard to map that to something that's actually meaningful and useful. But if you take it a few layers up through your department or through your teams or how you fit into your organization, you should be able to find where it does deliver value. And so wherever your ecosystem is, wherever the boundaries of what you influence are, that's the kind of thing you can map so that at least you understand that piece of it, even if your company is so large that you can't understand the whole map of the whole thing. So the second most common one that I talk to is, yeah, we have something that kind of sounds like that. Is this what we're talking about here? Does what we have work? And that was frequently, people do lean startup kind of things. Smaller companies are kind of doing the continuous value, information from the customer, turn it into the software, features, launches, that kind of thing. That is a component of a value delivery system. Other people say, oh yeah, we do SMART goals once a year, and then it kind of tapers off and we forget about them until it's time for bonuses, and then we go back and then we all try to make sure the work that we did matches the goals that we had. It's kind of a backwards way to do it, but that's what we have, that's what works. And other people use OKRs, which I think, by the sound of it, are the most easily meshed system with this value delivery system, just because they're so clean and focused. Anyone who's curious, I'm doing an OKR roundtable later in the year, so you can look on the calendar for that. But in this scenario where you have something and you think it's the components are there, is this going to work as a map of value delivery? The answer is probably yes. And I think this is a good time to mention tailoring. Another new piece in the Pinbox 7 that I'm glad is there is tailoring. So either for a project or a program, or in this case for the whole system, there's guidelines for how to take the standard and then how to take what you're actually doing and map them together in a way so that you're not wasting time on unused artifacts, you're not wasting resources on doing stuff that nobody cares about, but you're also not just going off Wild West doing your own thing and not respecting what your PMO or your organization needs. And it's something that as project managers, we all continue to do all the time. And so I'm glad that it's been a little bit formalized to say, here's the standard list of stuff that your company needs. What do you actually need to do for this project? Let's cut it down to size so that it makes sense, so that you're not doing a bunch of arbitrary, unnecessary stuff. And so the most important piece of this tailoring process is documenting what decisions you've made about what to keep and about what to throw out, what to not use, why you did it, and who's doing what pieces of it and why. And so if you have a system that covers most of the basics and you're going to add a few things and you're going to remove a few things from your standard, just make sure you write them down for those different projects, for those different things that you're tailoring and why you're doing it. That way, if someone goes back, if you're ever audited, if there's decisions that are made later that you're missing something from earlier, everyone will know why you did it that way. The third scenario that I came across from a couple people was, it's complicated. They thought, this whole delivering value as a systematic process sounds great, but let's be honest, my company is so big, I can't even begin to wrap my mind around how it all works. Or my company is so confusing, it's a mess, it's impossible to figure out, I'm not even going to try. And that is something that I completely understand, because especially from wherever you are in your organization, how much influence or how much information you can even get at that level, it might be just arbitrarily big or arbitrarily complicated. And interestingly enough, this is another place where this new version of the PMBOK has some information. They have some complexity framework information. There's a handful of models in there that are designed to help us and other people deal with complexities that arise in any environment, and we're applying it specifically to this value delivery piece. There are ways to get started, even though you're working with what appears to be an overwhelmingly complex or complicated solution. The most interesting one of the handful that are in there I pulled is the Cinefin model. It's the Cinefin complexity framework. It shows if you have just a mess of simple things, there's a way to categorize and organize and get them sorted. So for example, if you took all your Legos out and dumped them out, it's complex, but it's a simple kind of complex. All the pieces can be sorted out, it can be arranged, they can be grouped together, they can be figured out. But there are other environments that are more complicated or more chaotic or more just generally complex in different ways based on how many factors there are and what types of things you're dealing with, right? And it gives you a kind of a 3-step process in each case about what to do first and then what to do second and what to do third. And so you can look at that for reference. I'm not going to get into it too much, but generally speaking, it shows you a way to get started on something, no matter how complex or seemingly complicated things are, just in order to get a foothold on what you're trying to do and what you're trying to communicate. And so take a look at that section if you're feeling overwhelmed and underpowered for tackling some of this stuff. With that, my time's coming to an end, so we're going to do some closeout housekeeping items. So to recap, we looked at the value delivery as its new section in the PMBOK. We talked about the tailoring sections. We talked about the complexity model sections. There's a lot of other interesting new information in there, so I'm curious to hear what other kind of gems you're able to pull out of there. There's a lot of places to get started, whether you have a good structure that you just want to understand a little better and share with your team a little more effectively, so you want to make a map of it, or if you have nothing and you are working in a chaotic environment and you need to start from scratch for your own sanity and potentially for the sanity of your company, that's a great place to start as well. So if you'd like help talking through any of this stuff, we actually have a pretty significant reference library that includes maps like this, templates for all of the components that we use, both internally for our company and with our clients. We cover many topics, including strategic planning, project management, operations, analytics, service design, and your general kind of team and organizational tools. All of that fits together in an integrated way, both for our organization and for the clients we work with. So if you'd like to hear more about that, we have a reference library where all that stuff lives, and I can give you a tour of that if you're curious. Feel free to reach out to me. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. You can send me an email. I've got a website, and this is also the website of the consulting organization that I mentioned before. We'd be happy to hear from you if you're curious about talking through any of the things we talked about today or any of those other topics in that reference library. We'd be happy to share what we have and talk with you about any questions that might have come up. So I'd like to thank, again, PMI Mile High and the Symposium for this year for having me on as a speaker, and I hope to talk to you all soon.